Hello fellow germs. That's not an insult, it's actually relevant to the video. So in this video, I'm going to give you a breakdown of how I've made these microbial style experiments in Blender. Now this is not going to be a step-by-step video like the generative modeling crash course, shameless plug. It's going to be more of an overview. Now before we get into it, I should say that these files are available on my Gumroad if you want to pick them up and dissect them for yourself. But anyway, this is the first scene here, and I really like how this turned out. It's got some nice, what we would imagine to be microbes floating about, with a really strong depth of field effect to make it look like we're looking at something really close up. So that's really exaggerated. Some lovely particles floating around and maybe some kind of mucus-like stringy shape going through it. This is a more stylized scene, so it's not necessarily based in reality in any way. But the other file I want to show you, which is slightly more based in reality, is this painting microbes scene. So let me go into the rendered view. So this scene's more like if we were looking down through a microscope very closely at something, and we could see very simple, partially transparent microbes and other bits and bobs moving around. But one of the main points about this file is that we're allowed to paint the microbes using geometry nodes. So if I go into the weight paint mode with my microbe painter object selected, then I can change my brush size here and start painting them into the scene. And then if we look at these close up, you can see that they've got a kind of semi-randomized interior with a more translucent membrane going on the outside. The rest of the scene has been set up to have various amounts of debris as well, and again, a strong amount of depth of field going on. So we're going to talk about these scenes and how we get these stylized effects. So back to the original scene, how do we do the depth of field? Well, that's quite an obvious one actually. I'm in cycles with the camera selected. We go down to the camera properties here, and then we have the depth of field options. With depth of field, you can have a focus object, which means that the depth of field for that camera is going to automatically try and focus on the point where that object's origin is. Now in this case, like I have with my default file setup, there's always a world origin object in my scene. If I take a look and turn the overlays on, you can see that it's placed here pointing in the middle of this stringy object. So if I go back into the rendered view, if I press G and Y and move this further away, so we're moving it back throughout the scene, and I let that resolve a bit, then you can see the scene is much more blurry in this foreground and actually slightly clearer in the background here with this second microbe. And that's because the point of focus, our world origin object, has now moved backwards. Now, of course, you don't have to have a target object for the depth of field. We can remove this. And the point of focus then relies on this distance value. Of course, it's done in meters here because my scene is set to use meters as a measurement. But of course, that doesn't really make sense when we're trying to recreate the illusion of a really micro sense of scale. But, you know, if we scrub this back, then we will move that distance point of focus closer towards the camera again. So here we go. This stringy area is now more in focus. So I'm going to put that back to the world origin. I just thought I'd make a quick note about that. Now, for the intensity of the depth of field, we can imagine the f-stop value being how blurry it is. So if I scrub this down, it was on 1.5. If you put it down to 0.4, then we can see the things in the foreground and the background here are really dispersed. Now, of course, when we're trying to recreate things on the micro scale, really exaggerating the depth of field is a really quick and commonly used trick to make something look tiny. This is an effect that quite a lot of photographers like to use when trying to make large areas look like tiny models. I don't know if anyone's seen this tilt shift effect, whereby blurring the outside of an image like the bottom and the upper, you can make something look like a model city when it's actually just a real city. There's some really cool images online about that. Now you have other options here to control the look of the depth of field. This might actually be easier to demonstrate in Eevee, although the materials won't look exactly the same. But one thing you can see here is that if you look at the edges of this object, the lower the number of blades, the sharper those edges are going to be. And the more blades we use, it's going to try and round it out into more of a circle. There's one interesting video I recommend by Blender Secrets, or Jan van den Hermel, who has their massive Blender Secrets ebook, which is just full of amazing tips and tricks for Blender. They've done a really interesting quick video on how to make depth of field look really amazing for Eevee. So if you're interested in using it for that rasterization engine, then I recommend giving that video a watch. But anyway, let's go back to cycles. Moving on from the depth of field, I guess one of the next things to talk about would be the displacement for these objects. Let me just hide my particle systems. So how do we create these microbes? Now, what kind of add-on developer would I be if I didn't try to plug my own tools? So of course, these microbes are made with Biogen. So of course, if I add a subsurface modifier to this cube, let me push it past the limits and go to something like 8, for example. Let's apply that. Then I'm going to take my displacement, the alien preset, and apply that. Then you can see we start to get that effect going. We can talk a bit more about how this kind of displacement works. So for example, using geometry nodes, and you don't necessarily need to use geometry nodes. I mean, you could just use a regular displace modifier. So if I go and grab one here, then move that on, you could make any kind of procedural texture you wanted and stack these on top of each other and make some kind of interesting microbe effect. Maybe I'll do that now quickly, just to give you a nice alternative. Even though the Biogen add-on is free, but why don't we just give this a try while we're here? Let me add a bit of Voronoi on top. Scale that down a bit. So you can see that by adding up displacement modifiers like this, you can try and create some interesting new effects. Maybe a wood texture? Let's try, sorry, I'm just improvising here. Bad noise, that gives us a bit of variability. Scale you down as well. And you know, maybe you could add extra stuff around it. And if I apply my material, Microbe Fresnel 1, let's move my microbe out of the way. You know, it's not exactly the same, but it's just a quick demonstration. And there you go, that's something. I mean, it's a bit out of focus, but I think it works pretty well, especially when combined with the material that we will talk about in a sec. But anyway, that's a quick way you can do it just using Blender by combining these procedural effects. Let me remove those displace modifiers. Okay, so the Biogen add-on, when you're using this displacement preset, it automatically adds a geometry nodes tree with a collection of useful nodes inside of it. So it's using a pre-made texture, so not a generated one, an actual embedded packed texture file that I've created. And if I re-enable the modifier, this texture is scattered around using the scatter map node, which is a custom node I've set up. And if you want to learn how to make these, there are two good resources I can point you to. First of all, one of the most useful ones for this was Arundel's ETK toolkit. And secondly to that, Jonathan Lampel did a really good video about using these scattering techniques to distribute image content in the shader editor nodes. And he did that as part of his Scattershot project. And Scattershot is an add-on which helps you use these scattering techniques to make interesting materials where different decals or interesting textures can be combined together, scattered around to make something more interesting. I did a video about that earlier on. But anyway, in this case, we're using this technique to scatter a displacement texture around a mesh. So whereas that scattershot method would be for scattering a texture around a mesh, now we're doing a displacement. So I can control the strength of it. So I can make it really stick out if we want to do loads of weird effects. And for the case of the scatter map node, if I go into solid view, we can control how these edges blend together as well. So we can change the randomization of this. So I can smooth this as well, make it shade smooth. That helps out a little bit to suspend our disbelief that it's not real by maybe hiding the seams a bit more. But also imported in this preset node tree is a more organized triplanar version, which projects it from every major side. So it's a much more organized shape, but that's a bit less realistic for these kinds of effects. If you wanted to make your own custom displacement textures, there are several ways you can do that. If I take a look inside of my depth tool, which is again packaged inside of the Biogen add-on, sorry if I keep plugging it, I highly recommend this video by defaultcube/CG Matter, which talks more about the best ways to make displacement maps. But one really interesting thing we can do is sculpt displacement textures inside of Blender. So if I go into the sculpt mode here, and I should also say, if you do have Biogen and you want to open up this tool, if you go to the Biogen tab, down to the mesh effects, then under helper tools, you can open the depth tool folder, and that will show you the folder which has the depth tool blend file included inside of it. So I have my plane selected. Let me enable dynamic topology. Okay, that works. Let me grab the sculpting draw, put X and Y symmetry on. So what I'm essentially doing here is sculpting onto a plane, and we have this depth material, which is essentially just providing a black to white gradient on the plane. So when we render out the image, it's just going to be black and white, and the higher elevations for the mesh are going to give us the whiter pixels. So I go into the rendered view, I can take a look around this object in 3D space, but of course it's just a sculpture. Now, the important thing about using X and Y symmetry when sculpting maps like this is to make things seamless, because obviously the pixels going off the right here are going to be the same as the ones coming into the left. Of course, it really depends how you paint these things on as to whether or not it will look actually seamless, or whether there'll be a very easily identifiable repeating pattern. In the case like this, the pattern is very easy to see because these definite curves will be easy to see repeating in a line. But anyway, then you would just render something out like this, and then that's your displacement map. And then you can take that and package that in whatever you like. But anyway, going back to the scene, that's how I've put this kind of microbe together. The texture data is thrown to a vector scale with the normal as the input, and then this offsets the position of the vertices. Now, if you watch my generative modeling with geometry nodes crash course, then we go over displacement in that as well. So moving on from that, let's talk about the material, because this is part of the main stylization. How do we get this semi-transparent look? Well, again, this is sort of surprisingly simple to do. So let me just modify my windows here. So those of you that have been doing 3D work for a while will know that what we need here is a Fresnel effect, which is where essentially, and hold on, let me just speed up this rendering by turning off the density for the volume. So with the volume off, let's take a look at this microbe, and you can see that around the edges, so where the geometry is sticking up, two things are happening. It's brighter and it's more transparent. So to get the brightness going, use a Fresnel effect. In this case, we take the layer weight node and then plug the Fresnel value into the factor input of a mixed shader node. The first shader being plugged in is the base material, so this would be a principled BSDF, and the second shader is the one that's going around the outside, so this would be an emission node. So if I turn this all the way up, then we get a really, really strong effect going. but we can change the color and do all sorts of weird funky stuff with that. The blend value on the layer weight essentially defines the blending of that Fresnel from the edges. So if I scrub this up, you can see that becomes a lot more intense again. So these are basic good values that you can use. And you can see that as I change this color with these basic values, we can inject some of that to the edges of our objects. So if you want to get really stylized, you can do that. But let me reset that to what I had it as, something a bit gray. And maybe even in the case for this scene, we could get away with doing a little bit of green as well. So as for the subsurface, which is where we're getting these green elements coming in between the geometry, in the principal BSDF shader here, so the main material for the shader, and I can prove this by, changing the color. That's a pretty cool effect. Again, I'm keeping this on a bit of a grayscale dark value and letting the subsurface do most of the color work. First of all, we increase the subsurface value. So at 0, nothing is really happening and we can only see the Fresnel emission going on. And if I turn this up, then we get more and more of that subsurf, so more light is bleeding through the object. So I'll keep it on a low value at 0.150, and then we can change the subsurface color here, which is basically going to be our main color, so the light bleeding through is going to be green in this case. But if I reset that, you'll think, well, why is there green here, but there's no green on this node? Where does that green come from? Well, that's the subsurface radius. Now, this is a really important one to keep in mind, because I think a lot of people overlook this value. It's quite an important one. The subsurface radius is going to give us the color value for the bounce lighting here in these crevices. So where the light's transferring through, what color is that going to be? And you can think of this as an RGB value. So if I scrub the first value up, things are going to get much more red. Let me reset that. If I scrub the last value up, things are going to get a lot more blue. And then again, with the second value here, we have green. So we can actually combine these. Let me put red and blue up a bit, and now we've got a kind of pinky purple thing going on. And then let me put my volume back on for a bit of stylization. And then you can start to see how you can have lots of control over these effects. Maybe if I make the volume a bit purpley or a bit more blue, and brighten that up, and then there you go, you've got a different result going. But I think the dark grays and greens fit better with the idea of doing this kind of close-up microscopic work. I'm not sure why, but I think we just find green synonymous with biohazard and medical stuff. So for this stringy object, we're not going to go into too much detail with this because I might do that in a future geometry nodes video. So just taking a quick diversion into another file to take a look at some different wire experiments I've been doing. Again, and I say it in every video, thanks to Arendelle because he's been helping out with pretty much the mathematical logic behind these, how to select different points to connect the curves between. Working on these wire experiments gave me a lot of ideas for different ways that they can be used. So while I would love to use this for a sci-fi experiment, like a sci-fi environment experiment, one of the good use cases was for microbial stuff like this. So you can take a look at the node tree here. Again, we're not going to go through all of it because it might take a while. And I believe that Aaron has a more efficient version in his ETK toolkit now, so it'll probably work a lot faster than mine. But one of the interesting things you can probably take away from this is that we can construct curves using geometry nodes. But one of the important things about this is that you can define the profile for the curves as well. Now we're basically just using a circle as the profile, and the profile is essentially the outside shape for the curve. But you can replace it with anything you like. So any other curve that makes sense, which means you can get some really interesting shapes going with your curves using geometry nodes. So in this case, we're using a curve circle node to define the profile, which is going to turn the curved lines that we have made with this into an actual thickened curve. If I turn the radius down for this, then you can see what happens here. Now that we're working with just 3 points, it's a much more lower resolution shape, and because it's smooth shaded, then we're getting weird shading across the board. But say I went and made a curve primitive, maybe a star one, and then plug that into the profile curve, then we'll get a star shape instead. Maybe if I also set shade smooth, and can I turn that off from here? There we go. You can see this shape a bit easier now. So if I increase the inner radius a bit to thicken that out, then we can get a different shape going using this profile. This looks a bit more like toothpaste now, I suppose. Now in the render view, it looks different. That also reminds me of candy. Maybe that's another effect that we can use it for. Now when I do more studying and learn a bit more about how to make more efficient cable systems, then I'll do more videos about it. But for now, we're going to skip over that point because I don't really want to teach you a bad way of how to do it now. But if you want to get your hands on this and take a look at it yourself, then again, the file is available on Gumroad. So let's quickly talk about the particle system. This is done not using geometry nodes. It's done using the regular particle system. And if you want to learn some good values to use for those, then I've put it in one of my tips videos. I'll leave it on the screen here, where I talk more about how to use the particle systems. But basically, it's just instancing a separate object in the scene, which in this case is this particle sphere, which I have hidden away and outside of the camera. This is again using a similar material to the other microbes. I just called it tiny particle, but this has some stronger color values just to make it a bit easier to see inside of the scene. So you can see these blurry areas here where these particles are outside of the depth of field focus point. So I can change these values and make them blue instead, and they'll give us a more subtler bluish purpley vibe. I just think they're quite nice to add to the atmospherics of this scene. And again, to add on top of that, we have a little bit of a principled volume going in the world shader nodes, and the color of this is given a more subtle palish but still dark green, and we can change that value again to make it much stronger if we want. So that's a general breakdown of our first scene, the stylized one. So let's move over to our second one. Now, in terms of setting up the stylization, it's not that different to the first scene, to be honest. The depth of field is probably a lot stronger, so we're on 0.2 for the f-stop. The world origin object is still the focus point here, but now we're looking down onto it. We don't necessarily need to be looking down from this. I'm just doing it because when you're looking through a microscope, you're looking down, but you could just as well be looking forward or upwards or whatever you want. It doesn't really matter. I made sure that the depth of field was really strong because when you look at these microscope images, there's always something behind the depth of field there that's just out of the way, and it doesn't necessarily have to be really far away because we're essentially just looking at a slice, a plane where things are moving around. So I made a couple of basic objects. We have simple microbes here with an outer membrane and something inside. Now these might look like a weird shape when we're scrolling around them like this, but the reason they're this shape is to get this darkening and blurring around the edge. Because if we take a look at these materials, these ones rely on transmission and alpha values in the principled BSDF shader. So if I turn the transmission down, it doesn't look right because light's just bouncing off the object, it's not actually passing through it, so we want to have that all the way up. And then the alpha value, if it's all the way up, nothing's passing through, and if it's all the way down, then too much is passing through, so we find a midpoint here. Now if this object was too flat, then those edges would be a bit too weak, not very well defined, not very bold. So if we reset that again, I think now we get a more realistic look around the edge. I had a look at some microscopic reference imagery and I think that looks a bit better, but this is still not necessarily realistic. The second object inside, so a smaller one, is given a slightly different material with slightly different values. So the color is actually a bit different, it's a bit brighter. Now I do have these subsurface values up for these materials as well, but that's not necessarily required. I just think it makes more sense. Now for the groups or swarms of microbes which are scattered around here, this was done with geometry nodes. The way it was done was by having a basic mesh shape like this. So I essentially just took a plane and then subdivided it, so it turned into more of a circle. Then I grabbed vertices on the edge of those and then stretched them out using proportional editing. So I can demonstrate that here by grabbing a vertex and then moving it with G. But make sure we press O to toggle the proportional editing at the top here, and then I can press G and then move these points around. So we can do that. Now the points being generated on this are done with geometry nodes again. So if I click on the modifiers, we find the geometry node system, which is now here on the right. So if I maximize that, you can see that we're essentially just distributing points on that face we've made, and then instancing small microbes on top of these, and then randomizing the rotation and the scale. And in this case as well, we can offset their position. So if I scrub up the density, then we can add more and more microbes. So if I go into the rendered view, there's a lot of them there, but of course we don't need that many. Now the reason I'm offsetting the position of some of them as well is so we get some blurred, because they're moving further away from the plane where the world origin point of focus is. And I just like that because again, I think that's a bit more realistic, having some that look like they're part of that cluster, but are just a bit further away from that point of focus. Now, if I disable some of these, as for painting the microbes on, this is again surprisingly simple, which seems to be a theme of this video. I started off with a basic plane because I knew I wanted to paint using voxels, and the best way to do that, again, if you watched my generative modeling crash course, is to use weight painting. So we need a lot of vertex data to be able to decide where to generate voxels. So I have a plane, subdivided it many times to get lots of vertices in here, and you can see the grid here as we move up close. So looking at this through the camera perspective, I have a geometry nodes modifier, and let's go and take a look at how this works. So knowing we have that plane, we take the geometry, distribute many points on it, then we turn those points into a volume, then we turn that volume into a mesh, and then we give it a specific material. So that would be this inside mesh here. But an interesting thing here is that where we have the distribute points on face, we are passing a Voronoi texture through a color ramp and then subtracting it from our weight paint. So then if I change the scale of this, we can see how that pattern changes on the right. And this essentially gives us our variation for giving us the random noise inside of our painted area. So if I go back into weight paint mode, maybe go into solid, you can see where I'm painting here. And again, we can create this wherever we want. And because it's voxels, we can connect them together as well to make an even larger shape. Now for getting the outer membrane, that's again using exactly the same technique, but this time the radius for the points to volume is different. So it's a smaller radius for the interior matter, which is this, and then it's a larger radius to give us a wider area for the outer membrane. So if I increase this radius value again, we can see that the membrane increases in size as well. Once all of that's done, we're giving them different materials as well. So one of them has the microbe interior material, and the outer membrane has my Microbial Fresnel one, so it's a type of Fresnel effect. Now we did kind of skim over the influence of the Fresnel on this material, because even though it's not being used to make things glow, and as you can see the emission value is at 0 and the color is basically almost black, it's really helping to get us that darker outline around the edge, because if I plug the principled shader straight in, then we don't really have that here. Now you could probably play around with different values and maybe try and recreate something like that. Maybe we could invert things to make it darker. But I think by using the Fresnel here as a type of mask, it really helps by giving us a shortcut to that effect. So maybe that's a technique you can try if you're interested, essentially creating a plane and using it as a canvas to paint mesh content on. But of course, I've only really used it here as a flat plane. Because it's a plane, we can of course modify it. So, we could paint on any kind of surface and distort it however we like. I don't know what you would use that for yet, but I'm sure that people would come up with some interesting results. Alright, so that's a breakdown of these style experiments. Hopefully you found it interesting. I'd like to actually try making some proper artwork with this and maybe just keep trying different things. I like doing little studies like this because it gives me more opportunities to test new techniques and come up with new ideas for things that can be added to other projects like the Biogen add-on. But like I said, these two files are available on the Gumroad if you want to try it out. If you made it this far through the video, maybe leave a microbe emoji in the comments. I think that's a very appropriate one for this video. Remember to like, comment, subscribe, share the video, do whatever you like. Sign up to the Patreon if you want to support my work. Join my Discord server to take part in discussions and share your work. Follow me on social media if you want to take a look at experiments before they get turned into videos. So yeah, thanks for watching everyone. Have a fantastic day, and I will see you next time.